This is the Westside King's Church podcast, where we aim to encounter and embody the surprising grace of Jesus.
We've been looking forward to getting together and doing this podcast here for a little while. You and I just wrapped up a 3-part series on conversations on grief, and we had pretty good feedback. And there were people who really felt like this content would be like something that they would like to access in the future. And so we decided to make a podcast out of it. Maybe we'll start with, first I'll introduce myself. For those who don't know me, I'm Christin, and I work here at Westside King's Church. I work in kids department as well as doing some pastoral care stuff, which I love. I love these kinds of conversations, and I love the opportunity to really lean into this kind of work, especially when I get to work alongside and learn from people such as yourself, Brian. But not all of our community will know who you are. And so I think it's important to start off with an introduction from you, and maybe you can give us a little bit of background to yourself and sort of your experience and where you come from.
Yeah, thanks, Christin. And it was nice to do those sessions together. We had a chance to put the information together, put it into a semblance of order so that it's hopefully helpful for those who participated. And it's good to hear there was some good feedback. And what a great opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about grief and give the individuals who are listening to the podcast an opportunity to maybe get their bearings, get a little bit of context and a sense of direction. So yeah, I've been a Westside attender since 2004, which is a good chunk of time. I was a hospital chaplain for 6 years. I was a hospital chaplain in Banff for 3 years and then moved into Calgary. Was a hospital chaplain with Alberta Health Services from 2000 to 2003, and then had the opportunity to move into the grief support program, of which I was then for the next 17 years, and worked with a team of counselors. And we did individual counseling and also did groups for various types of losses. And I really appreciated the opportunity to be a part of such a great program and gleaned a few interesting I learned some lessons and some things I'd like to pass along. And that's it. And now I'm retired.
You're retired and still working.
A little bit, yeah. It's nice to have something to focus on, and it's nice to be able to draw on my experiences and stay involved in my area of interest. And really excited to be able to do this podcast.
Yeah, well, we're certainly appreciative and grateful that you've decided to still stay in this work a little bit, helping our community understand conversations on grief. So maybe if you could give us a little bit of an idea of what kinds of people would be listening to this podcast or might get something from this podcast, might find it useful or maybe helpful. And then maybe if you could just go over, this is actually going to be 6 weeks instead of the 3 weeks, because we really crammed in a lot of information in there. And we know that there was a little bit that we weren't able to add just because of the time constraints. So maybe if you just want to give us also a little bit of a breakdown of how these 6 weeks are going to work.
Yeah, thank you. Well, when we ran it previously, there was kind of 3 areas of interest for the people who participated. There were certainly those individuals who had experienced a primary loss in their life, whether it was a loved one or some aspect of their life that had been impacted by a loss. There was those who wanted some information on grief just to be able to support friends or family who were grieving. And then there was a few who were participants in volunteer programs, and whether it would be palliative care or just in a setting where there was people that were confronting some grief themes, that they just wanted some help to be able to know how to be just a better volunteer, to be able to come alongside people and support them in their grief. So those would be the 3, I think, core. And for those of you who are joining us, I appreciate to know if you're not one of those 3 areas. So
Yeah. And so then for the sort of the themes, the layout of the next sort of 6 episodes that we'll record here, How's that going to kind of break down?
Yeah, so for the first two sessions, it's going to be just a context for grief. I think the hardest thing about grief is we really don't know a lot about grief until we're in it. And then we're very limited in the resources. And there's not a lot of resources that we're going to look at to prepare ourselves for any type of a loss. So context is big for if we're dealing with our own grief, but also if we're supporting others or in that kind of an environment. So hopefully the first two sessions will lay out a really nice framework to understand grief better. The next two sessions are on grief, faith, and grace. And for those of us who carry a strong faith, and even those who don't, grace is a big component of finding our way through grief. Spirituality is a huge strength. I think we don't only look at it from a theological perspective, but I think there's a lot of experiential things that happen when we're in that environment that really can impact us at different levels and really speak to that spiritual dimension of not only in our own lives as we experience it move forward, but also when we're with people who may be questioning or trying to utilize that faith to be able to find a way to anchor themselves through their grief. And then the last 2 weeks are on the importance of continuing bonds. And by continuing bonds, and I'll talk a little bit about it more, is as we move forward in grief, it's nice to find ways to stay connected. And so special occasions become really important. The holiday seasons become really important. But I think if we grieve well, we find that way to be able to move through the time after the loss in ways that help us stay connected. So we're going to look at all the different ways we can do that. And it's an important aspect of finding that place to just feel comfortable with that grief, that we can carry that individual in our lives and just feel that they're a part of us still. So that's kind of the last 2 weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Brian. So I guess where we'll start might seem like an obvious place to start. Some people may feel like they've kind of got a definition here, but I think it's important for us to just define, what are we talking about? What is grief?
Yeah, in the broadest context possible, I like to think that grief is our response to the loss of anything that we value. So I'm just going to say that one more time, that grief is our response to the loss of anything that we value. Some things we don't value a lot, but they still impact us when that's no longer there. And then there's huge aspects of loss when we value it very deeply and it's no longer a part of our life. So grief comes in many different ways and can impact us at very, very deep depths.
Yeah. And I think maybe you will be able to, I think you might agree with this, is that a lot of times people don't know maybe possibly what their experience is grief. I think a lot of times we're used to hearing grief only in the context of bereavement, of a loss of life. But of course, and we'll cover that throughout our conversations here, of course, grief actually extends to all sorts of losses, which we'll get more into in a little bit here.
Yeah, I think because it's our response to the loss of anything that we value, that incorporates a lot of our life experiences and connections. And so some of those losses aren't acknowledged. I even think of currently what's unfolding in regards to COVID and just the impact on people's lives. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But some things have radically changed and there's different losses. And depending on the individual, yeah, it will impact you to different degrees, but there's also losses that don't get validated. And if they're not validated, they're disenfranchised. That means nobody really knows about them and nobody really pays attention to them and we don't really talk about them. Like a pet, I will use that as an example. Our own family, our pet cat, Pharaoh, and then Charlie most recently passed away. And we as a family had to make some very difficult decisions around that. But it's not something that we talked a lot about. You don't go out and telling everybody you know that unfortunately our pet passed away. So we carry losses like that and they're a bit disenfranchised. Yeah. And I remember when a good example was when my son was younger and we had a cat and he was 15 years old and unfortunately had heart complications, and we also had to say goodbye to Pharaoh. And my son really struggled with that for a period of time. And I remember I talked to him one day and said, "So how are you doing?" He says, "I'm not doing really well," because it was his cat. I said, if you talk to anybody or told anybody, he says, Dad, who wants to know that I lost my pet? He was 15 years old. So he carried that loss and nobody talked to him about it. So it was disenfranchised. There may be relationships that come and go, and there may be relationships that have ended. And again, we don't talk about them. They can be complicated. And so we walk with these disenfranchised losses that nobody really knows about because we don't bring it into conversations. It can be life-threatening conditions. I had another good friend that was diagnosed with a brain tumor this last year. A lot of complexities around that, and he didn't talk to too many individuals. It took a while, and he finally talked to me, but he didn't want to let everybody know that this is what he was struggling with. So we were able to have some conversations, but it's a loss that he knew about. And just because of the complexities of where we're at these days, it's not something that a lot of people knew. So it was disenfranchised. It wasn't able to be acknowledged and validated. For some, it may be different aspects of your mental capacity or emotional functioning that just aren't there, but you don't talk about it. So we actually kind of keep it, again, inside. Workplace losses. It's not, again, something that people talk a lot about, but people may carry those losses. It may be different health issues. It may be our independence. So these are all disenfranchised losses that I think are on people's radar personally, but they're not on anybody else's. So when I talk about, grief being our response to the loss of anything we value, wow, you start talking to people and it starts to slip out a little bit, that there's a loss here because they're talking about something that was and is no longer. So that's what I mean by disenfranchised losses. And so I think hopefully what these podcasts do is to be able to validate them, being able to be aware that there may be people we're talking to that have these losses, and maybe we'll get a little bit dialed into what those losses are. But also just being able to be aware that whoever we're talking to, just to be mindful that losses may be a part of their experience right now. And you may be the one that they're talking to that they say something about, or you may be experiencing it yourself and not talking to anybody. So yeah, that's what disenfranchised loss is.
Yeah, and also you might not even know, like we mentioned earlier, you might even not even know what you're experiencing is grief, because when you look at sort of this list of all the ways that grief can impact us, or all the places that grief can touch, that most everybody is dealing with some sort of loss, or they have in the past. Like, I don't think anybody is walking through life untouched by some level of grief. And what I really appreciate in conversations with you, Brian, is that it really just opens that up for it normalizes language, and we'll get a little bit into that, I think, around language of lament and stuff in a future podcast episode. But just this normalization of using the word grief, normalization of saying, hey, I'm feeling this way, and I want to discuss it. I want to acknowledge it as grief is actually quite powerful.
Yeah, it gives us a common framework by which to understand an experience, and something that hopefully we can fashion a conversation around.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier this idea of like COVID and that being its own sort of significant kind of section of losses in our lives, and that there's a lot wrapped up in that. Do you want to kind of just dive into that a little bit further, Brian?
Yeah, and I'm sure we all have a network. I know I have a network of friends that I'm in connection with, and you hear these different narratives around what's unfolding in their life because of what's happening with COVID. But you just think about some of the losses. I think of some of the ones that I've heard. Physical safety is a big loss. And even today, big discussion around what is safe again, now that we're again having to deal with the possibility of more infections. Relationship connections, people that you don't see that you used to see. I've had some friends, and different ways of looking at COVID. And so sometimes it's hard to find mutual conversation. But there are those connections that were there that are not there. And as now we're into the second year, I think of some people that I used to know a lot better and talk to, but we're not talking as much. So a loss of financial security. And huge impact on individuals who have had to face into some of the strategies that have been utilized to keep people safe. The loss of normalcy. For some, the loss of human contact. And for sure, we saw a lot of that in regards to the seniors complexes, elderly that at the beginning were just kind of isolated. So again, a loss. And personal agency, that ability to have an impact and make a difference. Sometimes it's always being told what we need to do, and sometimes you lose that ability to have that personal agency. Stability would be another loss. Mental health, we're hearing more about the mental health complexities as a result of COVID. And some people are carrying it, and what do you do with that? Who do you talk to? And are you looking at it in the context of maybe a loss because of just all what I just mentioned? Yeah. Personal health, not getting out as much, not being able to do as many activities. For faith, not being able to maybe attend your faith community as much as you would. I know I was part of a home group, and we haven't met in person in a home for a long time. And there's that loss of connection. We were able to sit in the backyard and have a couple of fires, which was nice. But again, just that sense of faith connection. Workplace, another loss. I know I have a family member that's been working out of our home. It's my son. He's been working for 1.5 years in his office in the house here without being able to connect up with his coworkers. And then there's the anticipatory losses of what could happen and all the fear and anxiety that goes along with that. So when we're talking, I call them COVID conversations. And when we're talking to individuals just in daily conversations, seemingly about changes that never stop, just some of these different losses that may come into the conversation that can be validated and just acknowledged. And they're just being a safe place for people to maybe talk a little bit about that anxiousness and just the uncertainty and just the loss of everything I just mentioned. But the hardest thing is about being able to bring it into a conversation. It's even harder to find somebody that can validate it and acknowledge it. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of things going on with people and family that we know that just need a great conversation.
Yeah. So I think grief, we could probably have a whole year of podcasts to talk about grief, because there's actually just so much to unravel and so much to discuss. It's intricate and it's intimate, and everybody's grief is just so personal. But it strikes me that maybe there are some, unknown facts, some kind of key points that maybe are helpful for us to know. So in your eyes, what do you think we need to know about grief, sort of as a kind of fundamental starting point?
Yeah, and getting back to the definition that it's our loss to anything that we value, and how we value some of the things really dearly. One thing for sure that we know about grief is it's going to take longer than we ever imagined. I like to give grief big windows, and again, it's all relative on the type of loss and to the depth of that loss and that connection. But it will always take longer when it comes to the loss of a loved one. Our culture seems to think we should get it through it sooner than later, when really it's kind of later than sooner. I like to give big time windows for loss. I like to think that if it's the loss of a loved one, I don't think it's unusual to say, let's give it a year. I like to think we've got to navigate, and we'll talk a little bit about what we've kind of got to mindfully get through in that first year. But I like to think that when we get to the anniversary of the loss, it gives us a little bit of a read on how we're doing. And it wouldn't be uncommon for people who phone the grief support program to have gone through that year, and at that 1 year anniversary, realizing that, wow, I'm still really not doing really well. I'm still really struggling. And that's when people might pick up the telephone, because for people who haven't been through grief, don't understand or haven't had to navigate over a longer period of time. So grief will surely take longer than we think. It will also take way more energy than we ever imagined. Grief is just tiring. There's just so much going on at so many different levels that we really need to be mindful that grief is tiring, and to be able to pace ourselves accordingly. Grief may roll over us. I call them grief waves. These acute upsages of grief that just kind of roll over us and just kind of put us in a place where we're just overwhelmed. They're like a wave. We can call them a grief burst. And they can happen at any point in time. Just anything can happen in our environment. You think you're doing really well, and all of a sudden there's just this huge emotional wave that kind of rolls over us. And that's not unusual. And we need to give it time for those waves to continue to roll. But hopefully as time passes, the waves aren't as big and they don't come as often, and we find out a way to get our feet underneath us again. When we do have those grief bursts and those anniversaries or different times of the year, it's not unusual that there can be different issues that may arise that may have been connected to that loss. There may be a lot of feelings, a lot of unresolved emotions, a lot of memories, and that it's one of those waves, and not to think there's something radically wrong, but just to be able to be mindful. And again, over time, hopefully the waves diminish. But old issues and conflicts can just come up. And again, it's hard to find anybody to talk to. And with that, you'll find that maybe certain dates are tough. Certain seasons can be hard. Very powerful, just so many environmental factors that when we're impacted with a traumatic loss, and it just touches us at such depths that we can be triggered at certain times of the year and certain events. But these are all things that are going to impact us, and we just need to know that these are normal responses that can unfold for a long time after the loss.
Yeah. So I think anybody who has struggled through grief or experienced grief knows that there are a lot of challenges to an individual who is grieving. And I think as a society, maybe we don't, there just are challenges to ourselves in understanding grief, even if we're not going through grief. But as somebody who is maybe coming alongside somebody who's grieving, a family member who's grieving, we also really struggle, and there's challenges with grief in that. Can you speak a little bit more towards some of these challenges we have with grief when we talk about it?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's hard to talk about. And again, because we don't know how other people are going to respond, that it's not unusual that grief just makes other people uncomfortable. And I think that's a big, it's a big struggle in giving people the feeling that they can say something and it's going to be honored. And so you're kind of weighing it out all the time. And so, yeah, it makes people feel uncomfortable. So because of that, again, we don't talk about it. There is this idea to get over it quickly. I think we look at our culture, we look at if you've experienced a loss and you have a job and it's a particular workplace, you may get a week off, maybe two, but you don't get a lot of time off. And I think that really sends a message that, well, you get this amount of time off and hopefully you come back and you've been able to work through your grief. And so there is this idea that we need to get over it sooner than later. And when I think it's later than sooner. So that can be very difficult, that you may mention it once, and if a person doesn't respond, you never mention again, and yet you carry it and it still remains disenfranchised. It's hard because of that awkwardness to maybe find the support that you need. It's hard from home. It may be a family circle that you don't know who you can talk to. Your social circles, is there safety there? Is that something that is part of the friendship connection to bring in some very difficult struggles? And it's hard when you've got relationships and it's all around activities and life is really good, and all of a sudden something very difficult happens. How do you enter that into the conversation? So it's hard to find those connections in our families, in our community circles, and even in our faith communities. It's hard to know how to say what and what kind of a response because of the perceptions that have that faith piece, and we'll touch on that in week 3 and 4. It also may be hard because of our own family histories and how our losses in the past were honored or not dealt with. That I think we all grew up in a family system, and I mentioned that we've had a couple of cats that have had to have veterinary involvement, and we've had to discuss and we've had to work through the process and come to the conclusions, and how is this going to affect the family, and what are they offering us in regards to ending our cat's life. And we had to work through that, talk about it, and then we had to, grieve forward together as a family. And I know for the cat that we recently had to say goodbye to, I got the paw print, and I had Charlie cremated, and we'll spread them in the backyard. And I think in our family, good examples of trying to move through loss and talk about it. Well, that isn't always the case in families. It's an awkward topic. People don't know what to say. So maybe we've grown up in an environment where losses occurred, but nobody did say anything. So we just don't know what's normal. So that also makes it difficult to manage our grief and find somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
Our cultural background and traditions. Some cultures are very open about losses and embrace it and have lots of rites and rituals that last for a long period of time. It seems that we're losing more and more of those, that we don't give ourselves the time. I don't know if anybody's been to a wake lately, or opportunities to gather in people's homes. We don't see people mourning and expressing their grief, which they used to do, and wearing black. So again, we're living in a culture where grief is kind of confined. And so culturally, some cultures can talk about it more. It's more part of just a moving forward, but then some cultures, it's a little bit more difficult. So it's about being mindful of that aspect of it. Age makes a big factor. And also that no two people share the same response in grief. And so you kind of, am I grieving properly? Or you hear a loss and you wonder, they're not doing so good. So these all make it difficult to manage grief if you're carrying it, because there's all these factors that are kind of there that are woven into the fabric of our families and communities. It's almost like walking up a river the wrong way.
Yeah.
You've got this current coming at you and it's wearing, but you just don't know who to talk about it. So yeah, that's what makes it difficult.
Yeah, it's like our whole society isn't set up to really honor grief or make room or make space for grief, which obviously makes it extremely challenging. And I think all around there's just so much pressure on people, right? Like you had mentioned, oh, I need to be over it. Maybe because I'm tired of feeling this grief, but also maybe because somebody else is tired of hearing, about me talking about my grief. Like there just seems to be pressure kind of on all sides.
Yes.
Which just makes it so much more challenging. And then pressure on people who are trying to support those who are grieving, saying, I just don't know what to say. And like you had mentioned earlier, sometimes the best thing you can do is just name it and say, this is just awkward. I don't know what to say in this moment. And sometimes that helps relieve, some of those pressures.
Yeah. I'm a golfer, and I like to get out on the course, and I've got, a network of people that I golf with, but every once in a while I go and I'm connected up on the golf course with people I don't know. And when you're spending, 4 hours with somebody and the conversations unfold and you kind of get a little bit of history and a little bit of their background. And over the years, I've been really surprised that in our conversations with people that I've just met, maybe walking along and out will slip that, oh, I'm single, my wife passed away, or I experienced a loss a number of years ago and golf helped me stay connected. And, anytime that I'm with somebody and I get hear a little bit of that story, that little radar goes off and it's always, what was your wife's name, or what was your child's name? And how long ago was that? And just being able to acknowledge it. And sometimes I think it just slips out. And I think hopefully one of the benefits about maybe doing these podcasts is that when you hear somebody say something and it's about a loss, it just kind of slips out in the conversation that we can go, oh yeah, well, how do I follow this up? Because you may be the person that finally they're starting to talk to. And it's just because not only that they wanted to do that, but somehow they feel safe and they just kind of send a little floater out there to be able to just to see where you're at. So I'd like to think there's lots of people, and we're walking through a network of individuals, whether it be in our communities, in our faith communities, in our job places, where people are experiencing all the losses that I've talked about. And sometimes it just slips out in conversation. And just being mindful that we may be the ones that are there to be able to open up the conversation. I like to think that maybe as a Christian, as part of a bigger kingdom, that God's very aware in people in their grief, and because God's not speaking to us audibly, sometimes I like to think God moves somebody alongside just to be able to carry the load a little bit. So I think the hardest part about that is we really don't know how to do that. And so hopefully, again, these podcasts will help.
Yeah. So there are various factors when we talk about a person being able to manage their grief. What do you think? We've talked a little bit about sort of what kind of impacts that and what contributes to managing that grief. And then we get into kind of grieving styles. So can you talk a bit more about grieving styles? And
Yeah, I think it's one thing to be able to hear another person's story of loss. And when the dialogue starts to open up and you start to get a little bit more, and it may be over a number of conversations that you may have with somebody. I mentioned about a friend who had a health issue that mentioned it originally just in a telephone call. And then I happened to get together and followed up and said, when we were on the phone, you mentioned about this test. And it opened up the conversation a little bit more. And one thing led to another. And so it's important, I think, when we start to engage an individual who has been through a loss, whatever degree that value was and however important that loss was, that there's two different styles of grief. And I think we just need to take a little bit of time and acknowledge what those are. The two styles of grief, on the one hand, there's a style of grief, and it's called a feeling style of grief. I guess a clinical word would be an intuitional sense of grief. And if you're an intuitional griever or a feeling griever, then you're going to experience your grief emotionally. There's going to be intense feelings. There's going to be lots of tears, lots of sadness. The waves will just kind of roll in and roll over, and you feel it because you carry it, and it's just so deep. It's also expressed emotionally, that if you're an emotional griever, it's nice to be able to share the tears and have somebody acknowledge the tears. And the feelings precede and they dominate everything else. The person's grieving because I guess the phrase that goes along is they wear it on their sleeve. And when they're talking to them, there's this overwhelming sense of sadness, despair, and loss. So feeling grievers are just very transparent in their grief. And sometimes it's hard to know what to do with that. Sometimes there's so much emotion there that you kind of go, oof, maybe, and you kind of back off a little bit. On the other hand, there's another style of grief called the thinking and doing style of grief. The clinical word for that would be instrumental. And people who are thinking and doing grievers, they need to work their way through grief. Try to make sense of it. The feelings are limited or toned down. You might not even know they're grieving because you don't see a lot of emotion, but they're talking about it. They're working on estate issues. They're just trying to mindfully kind of march through their grief. And they do that because they're very good at problem solving. They can take care of things. They oversee the family and know what needs to be done when. And for sure, if you're a thinking grieving, that thinking and doing, it precedes and it dominates the feelings. Now, you can move back and forth depending on a loss. It's not like you're on one side all the time, although some people predominantly can. But we are back and forth. And I remember when my mother passed away, I'm pretty much that thinking and doing griever. I'm a very instrumental griever. I like to have my ducks in a row. And yet when my mother passed away, I clicked into that gear. I met with my dad. We got the funeral arrangements. I went through that. I put the eulogy together, kept it really together. And then after the eulogy, I went into the downstairs of the church and I just broke down. It just came flooding out because for a week I hadn't been able to really show my grief, and I was more on that instrumental side. I remember my sister came down to find me and said, how are you doing? And I said, well, Brenda, it's a bit of a rough thing. It's really hit me. And she says, she said it was good to finally see that, because I was really wondering where your grief was, and you're a grief counselor. And so I was very much on that thinking and doing, and I needed to be that. On the other hand, I had another loss where I couldn't stop crying. It just overwhelmed me, and for days. And so we can move back and forth. I think I'm a little bit more predominantly a thinker and doer. Mm-hmm. And we can kind of get stereotyped with the gender issues here. I think typically there's this idea that men are a little bit more the thinker and doers, and maybe women are a little bit more the feeler, but that's not always true. And as a grief counselor, I would have, women come in that would be really, somebody had said, you need to talk to a grief counselor because you're just not showing any emotion. And when you talk to them, they were showing emotion in a different way, but they were more thinkers and doers. On the other hand, I'd have some men that come in that were so socialized to suck it up and march through it and don't show any emotion. And then you would be able to sit down and talk about the grief story and start to talk about memories in this individual, and they'd fill up a bucket full of Kleenex as they finally, the dam broke. So I think it's really important for ourselves. It's important to know maybe where we are in our grief, but I think it's really important that when we come alongside and we support people in grief, that we're able to ascertain, okay, are they a feeling griever, or are they a thinking griever? And then we are able to kind of adjust and just be with, but knowing what style of grief they have. And so I think it's really important to know that. And I think it doesn't go back very long ago when this information and these dichotomies of grief came out. And I think it's really helpful, particularly if you're walking with a friend, that you start to pick up the nuances of, oh, they're more of a thinking griever, or, oh, wow, they're really deep in their feelings and there's lots of tears. So how do I come alongside? So yeah, those are the styles of grief. And so again, it's just into the complexity of knowing how to be able to manage our grief. And maybe it's another reason why people don't share their grief as much, because maybe they're feeling a little polarized on one of those sides and say, oh, they're not going to know what to do with me. So just some good information there.
I think that's really helpful, Brian. And especially for people to understand that it's not wrong the way you grieve. Like, maybe some people think that, I don't know if I'm doing this right, and I don't know if there's some way else I'm supposed to be in order to grieve. So I think it's important for people to know that, like, you're grieving how you grieve, and that's okay. You don't have to. And we'll get a little bit more into, I think, some family stuff and just talking about sort of the conflict with that, and when you bring different styles together. And how challenging that can be. So there's this idea that we've talked about, you and I, in these sessions, but then also just conversation between you and I, about this idea of art, the art of being with people, coming alongside and falling behind. And I think it's such a beautiful way to talk about how we are in community with one another, and how we can support and really be a community that honors grief and makes space for it. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, the art of being with.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to a little bit around this idea that there is a lot of grief, and I think particularly in the network of people that we're connected with. And one of the hardest parts about being able to come alongside and to be with somebody is we don't know how to position ourselves. And so I think hopefully the more we understand about grief, it opens the door to come alongside and not be judgmental, that we can hear a grief story. We can know how to be with somebody, maybe if they're a feeling griever, an instrumental griever. We get a sense of how hard it is, maybe a result of their background or just the complexities of the loss. And I don't think we've got a podcast on trauma, but any loss of somebody heartfelt, is traumatic. It impacts us to the very core of our being. So how do we come alongside, and how do we, I guess, send out the vibes that, hey, we're here and we can listen to you? So I like to think that in the family of God, so to speak, that we are there to mourn with those who mourn, to weep with those who weep, and to be able to be empathetic and compassionate. So I like to think it's a bit of a two-stage process. We come alongside, and if we come alongside, we create a safe environment. We have open ears. We're not judgmental. We can grasp and hear the narrative behind the loss. And I think once we set out the parameters of coming alongside, we then shift it and we fall in behind. We let them take the lead, but we feel comfortable to be able to be in that support capacity. And that takes a bit of time to be able to accommodate that. But I think that's what trust is all about. That's all about that genuine sense of friendship, that sense of goodness, that sense of kindness, that sense of compassion, that we come alongside and then we fall in behind. And about being able to fall in behind is about being able to be interested. It's about being invested, and it's about being inquiring and saying and checking in, where are you at? So we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. But I think to be able to come alongside, we need to have a bit of a map in how to get there, and then develop the skills to be able to fall in behind and just let them know that they're supported. And I think in these days and times, just in the neighbors on my cul-de-sac and people that I've talked to over the last year and a half, you get into one of these, what I call these COVID conversations, and something slips out and you find something about somebody that you never knew. And so then at that point, it's about being able to come alongside and say, did you just say, or I think I just heard you say, and so it's the art of coming alongside and then falling in behind by being able to get a sense of that timing to let them know there's support there. So again, in regards to these podcasts, hopefully this is kind of the way that we can be there for each other. But I think it starts with just having a context for grief and just being able to be aware of some of the things we talked about today, normalize them as some of the hurdles that maybe you have to get over, but being able to acknowledge and being able to be in that position to be able to just validate losses and be that person for them.
Yeah, that's great, Brian. Well, I think that is where we are wrapping our conversation for this episode. I really appreciate you being here, and I never tire of these conversations with you, Brian, and I always learn so much from you. And so thank you for being here, and thank you to those who are listening, and hope it is helpful for you. And we will see you with our second episode shortly.
To be continued.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.